Let's come back to what's in this IPCC report, what it does tell us from the scientific community, at least in this report. Dr. Paul Spence is an oceanographer and climate scientist from the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Climate System Science. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon. Look, this report suggests we are going to see even worse sea level rise than the previous IPCC report. I think it's 10 centimetres worse by the end of this century. What new information has led to that conclusion, do you know?
Yeah, I think it's just a progression of the IPCC information. And so the IPCC has been around for over 20 years now, and the message has been very consistent throughout, that the oceans are warming, the ice caps are melting. We just have more and more data now, and the newer data over the last 5 or 10 years is showing that things are accelerating much more rapidly than we initially expected. And so when you look at...
So what is that new data? Because the IPCC reports do, over the years, show different conclusions around how much sea level rise there would be by the end of the century. So what is this new data?
Yeah, so it's not so much new data, it's just a continuation of the time series. And so when you look at the continuation of the satellite records coming out of Antarctica, of melting of the Antarctic ice sheets, the continued melting of Arctic sea ice, the continued warming of the ocean, it's just happening at an accelerated rate. So it's not like there's been a new big signal that we've discovered, it's just that the information is becoming more and more clearly frightening, to be honest.
How certain is that projection or prediction, though, given we do see different numbers from the IPCC?
Sure. So when you're talking about sea level rise in particular, that one's a tricky one because we're quite clear on how much the oceans, if the ocean's warm, how much that will impact sea level. The thing that we're less certain about is how much of the ice sheets are going to melt, and that's the big scary one. We're talking, a ballpark by the year 2300 of 5 meters of global sea level rise, and that's a terrifying, terrifying number. The key question there is, what is the stability of the Antarctic ice sheets? And that's, that's a difficult challenge. There's no doubt that sea level is rising.
You're saying there's less certainty when it comes to that particular aspect.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as we've gone through the science, we're becoming more and more certain of what's happening around Antarctica. But certainly, if you look at the uncertainty bars, that's where they lie when it comes to what's happening in the Antarctic ice sheets for sea level rise.
I mean, how uncertain? Can you give us a sense how uncertain that is?
Yeah, so by the year, we could be looking at 1 to 5 meters, even up to 15 meters of sea level rise by the year 2500 of global sea level rise. Those are the numbers that are being bandied around. That's, terrifying prospects.
And that's obviously a long way out. We're talking, nearly 500 years from now. What about in this century? What about in this century?
Yeah. So this century, I think you're pretty much locked into a meter, a little over a meter of sea level rise for sure. I stand by the statement that...
How certain is this projection?
Oh, I think that's quite certain. There's high confidence in that. Yeah, high confidence in that. I think, if you were looking at building or, buying a house as a 30-year-old person in Australia right now and where you would want it to be, and you're thinking of passing that house down to your children in 50 years or so, I think you'd be remiss to not make sure it's a couple meters above sea level. But when you start including things like storm inundation and things like that, and if you do maps around Australia, where does 2 meters, 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise leave you? Well, if you're living in the Gold Coast, I think that's a troubling place.
Well, it would be. How fast are sea levels rising right now, and have we seen acceleration in recent years?
Absolutely. Sea level rise is accelerating very clearly in the satellite data. I think right now we've only about 15 centimeters of global sea level rise, which has already had significant impacts around the world. The acceleration as we go through time is going to continue to be clear just through thermal expansion, the continued melting of the ice. So I think it's the evidence is clear. Right now it's about 3.6 millimeters a year. How does that compare to, say, 100 years ago? Right, good question. Pulling these numbers out of the top of my head right now are difficult. It's certainly been accelerating the time series for sure. I think we've looked at 15 centimeters of anthropogenic sea level rise so far.
Since,
by the year 20...
Since what? Since the start of last century? Is that, there's 15 centimetres. Is that since when?
Yeah, I would say around 1950, I would suggest. Yeah.
All right, so we've seen 15 centimetres since the middle of last century, roughly.
Yeah, and most of that's been happening in the last 2 decades.
Most of it in the last 2 decades, okay.
Absolutely, and the rate of acceleration is clear. Absolutely
okay,
clear.
look, I'm sure you're aware, critics of this report and the scientific view on climate change point out that Tuvalu, we've seen the land mass of Tuvalu grow rather than shrink in recent years, based on findings of work at the University of Auckland using satellite data. What's that? What do you say to that?
I think that's hilarious. I mean, there's 2 things that can happen, right? The oceans can rise, or the land underneath the oceans can rise. And so both things can happen. In many places of the world, the Earth's crust is lifting up, and so that can happen as well, for sure. But I think, we're looking at a future. It's close to Australians. Many Australians love visiting places like the Maldives. It's very difficult to envision a scenario where the Maldives is above sea level, going forward in the 21st century. That's a beautiful place that we love about, but it's more difficult places like Bangladesh, home to hundreds of millions of people. These places are in serious trouble. There's no question about that. And this is just one aspect of climate change, is sea level rise, but there's many other.
What about in the oceans themselves? Again, some say, warmer oceans aren't all bad, that it can actually be good for sea life. You're an oceanographer. Is that true?
Yeah, oceans can adapt if we give them time. It's simply the rate of change that things are happening at. Dealing with Australia, the reliable numbers that I have now are something like the Great Barrier Reef, which is clearly a world treasure. By the year 2050, we're talking of 70 to 90% of it being dead. And so, you'd have to be pretty optimistic to think that that's going to be a good change. Then when you go down to the Tasman Sea, it's warming up faster. It's one of the fastest warming places in the world, just off Australia's coast. I think you'd be remiss to think that the rate of change that we're dealing with is going to be very, very difficult for countries and ecosystems to adapt to.
Now, what do you say about the issue of plastic waste in the ocean? Our Prime Minister has been talking a lot about this at the UN. How serious is this as an issue? And I guess, is it worth comparing the seriousness of this to the climate change issue?
Sure. Plastic in the ocean is a serious problem. There's a lot of it in the ocean. It's not good for ecosystems. But to equate it as being an equivalent challenge or as important of a problem as climate change is simply misleading. This is just a misdirection approach by people to avoid dealing with dealing with the climate change issue. I think it's just whitewashing the issue. It's trying to misdirect people away from the real problem. It's unethical to point to that as a bigger problem than climate change. Absolutely.
Okay, well, to be fair, I don't know if the Prime Minister's saying it's a bigger issue, but it is fair for him to focus some effort on this right now, isn't it?
I think you should focus some effort on it, absolutely. But to say that we're going to focus on that instead of dealing with climate change is wrong. I think it was wrong.
I don't think he's saying that. I think he is saying they're doing both.
Yeah, I think, well, for him to go to the UN and say that Australia is dealing with climate change at an effective level is inaccurate, absolutely inaccurate.
So why do you say that?
Because the pertinent number is, what are Australia's total emissions doing as a nation? They're consistently going up over, they went down in March of this year, I think, but in general, they're consistently gone up, except for the period where we had a carbon trading system in place. Also, I think it's important to remember those are just our local emissions, but Australia is responsible for 35% of coal exports, global coal exports. This is a huge problem.
All right, look, we do have to leave it there. Dr. Paul Spence from the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Climate System Science. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.